In the summer of 1834, the city of Jerusalem did not fall to a foreign army. It rose against its own rulers, not nobles, not generals, farmers. This channel explores the quiet moments that reshape history not through spectacle but through decisions, pressure, and systems that slowly stop working. Stories where outcomes feel less like victories and more like inevitabilities, because some uprisings are not born from ideology. They are born from exhaustion. This is not just the story of a peasant revolt. It is the story of why a centuries-old imperial system suddenly lost its grip on one of the most symbolic cities on earth, and why restoring order required more than force. To understand the siege of 1834, you have to step back from the walls of Jerusalem and look at the structure that had governed the region for hundreds of years. For 4 centuries, the lands of Greater Syria, including Palestine, had been part of the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman rule was not gentle, but it was predictable. Local elites collected taxes, rural leaders mediated disputes, villages maintained a degree of autonomy as long as they paid what was owed. Power was distant, and distance created stability. Then, in the early 19th century, that balance broke. To the south, in Egypt, a new kind of ruler had emerged, Muhammad Ali of Egypt. He was technically an Ottoman governor, but in practice he ruled as an independent monarch. He built factories, a modern army, and a centralized state that demanded far more from its people than the old system ever had. Modernization, in his vision, required control. In 1831, his son, Ibrahim Pasha of Egypt, marched north with that new army. Within a year, Ottoman forces had been driven out of Syria and Palestine. The transition was swift, efficient, and largely uncontested. At first, many locals welcomed the change. Ottoman administration had been distant and often corrupt. Egyptian rule promised order, reform, and protection from Bedouin raids. But reform has a cost. Ibrahim Pasha did not intend to rule indirectly. He imposed direct taxation, centralized authority, and most explosive of all, conscription. Young men from farming villages were to be taken into the army, trained, and sent far from home. For peasants, this was not service. It was disappearance. Agricultural communities depended on every able-bodied man. Losing sons meant losing harvests, protection, and survival itself. Families hid their boys in caves, sent them into the hills, or falsified records. Entire villages conspired to resist quietly, but quiet resistance has limits. Egyptian officials responded with harsher enforcement. Weapons were confiscated. Local leaders were bypassed. Taxes rose to support the expanding army. What had once been a loose imperial arrangement was becoming a tightly controlled state. To administrators in Cairo, this was progress. To villagers, it was suffocation. Tensions spread across the countryside in 1834. Clashes broke out in towns and villages throughout Palestine. But Jerusalem was different. Jerusalem was not just another provincial city. It was sacred to 3 religions, symbolically vital and strategically important. Control of Jerusalem signaled legitimacy. Losing it signaled weakness. And yet, the city was vulnerable. Egyptian forces were stretched thin, suppressing unrest across a wide region. Garrisons were small, supply lines were long. Local cooperation, the quiet foundation of imperial rule, was collapsing. In May 1834, thousands of armed peasants from surrounding areas began moving toward the city. They were not a unified army. They were farmers carrying muskets, tools, and whatever weapons they owned. But they had numbers and they had anger. Inside Jerusalem, the small Egyptian garrison prepared for siege. Officials tried to rally loyalists, but trust had eroded. Many urban residents sympathized with the rebels. Others simply waited to see who would win. When the peasants breached the city's defenses, chaos followed. Government buildings were attacked, officials were hunted, prisons were opened, weapons were seized. The symbols of centralized authority, records, tax offices, and administrative quarters were destroyed. This was not random violence, it was targeted. The rebels were dismantling the machinery that had begun to control their lives. For several days, the city was effectively in their hands. Egyptian authority collapsed. Communication with outside forces was cut. What had been a reform project now looked like a full-scale insurrection. But revolts built on outrage faced a strategic problem. They lacked long-term coordination. The peasants could capture the city. Holding it against a professional army was another matter entirely. News of the uprising reached Ibrahim Pasha quickly. For him, the loss of Jerusalem was not just a local disturbance. It threatened the credibility of Egyptian rule across the entire region. If one city could defy him successfully, others would follow. He responded with speed and calculation. Rather than rushing blindly toward the city, he gathered reinforcements, secured supply routes, and ensured that his army could sustain a prolonged operation. Discipline, not revenge, would restore control. When Egyptian forces approached Jerusalem, they did so as a modern military organized infantry, artillery, cavalry, and experienced officers. The contrast with the peasant fighters was stark. The rebels had courage, the Egyptians had structure. The retaking of the city was brutal but methodical. Positions were cleared street by street, suspected leaders were captured, resistance pockets were isolated and eliminated. order returned, not in a dramatic clash, but in a series of controlled operations. Once Jerusalem was secured, the campaign moved outward into the countryside. Villages that had supported the revolt were disarmed. Fortified hideouts were destroyed. Thousands were arrested. Punishment was severe, but it was also strategic. The goal was not merely to punish rebels, it was to demonstrate that centralized authority could reach even the most remote communities. Conscription resumed. Taxes continued. Weapons were tightly controlled. On the surface, Egyptian rule had prevailed, but something fundamental had changed. Before 1834, imperial governance in the region relied heavily on local intermediaries, village chiefs, clan leaders, urban notables. After the revolt, trust between rulers and rural populations was deeply damaged. Control increasingly depended on direct military presence rather than cooperation. This made the system stronger in the short term and more fragile in the long term. The Peasant Revolt of 1834 also revealed something larger. Modernization imposed without consent can destabilize even long-standing political orders. The Egyptian administration had tried to transform society rapidly, assuming that efficiency would outweigh resentment. Instead, it triggered a widespread uprising that required enormous resources to suppress. Within a decade, Egyptian control of Syria and Palestine would collapse under international pressure and renewed Ottoman intervention. The region returned to Ottoman rule, but the old balance was gone forever. Local populations had learned that imperial authority could be challenged. Empires had learned that reform could provoke revolt, and Jerusalem had demonstrated that even a city layered with centuries of history could become a battleground not between great powers, but between rulers and the ruled. Today, the siege of 1834 is often overshadowed by larger conflicts that would follow, yet it marked a turning point, the moment when rural populations asserted themselves against centralized modernization, forcing empires to confront the limits of power. It was not a revolution in the modern sense. There was no manifesto, no unified leadership, no vision of a new state, only a refusal to disappear quietly into a system that demanded too much. In the end, the peasants did not win, but they proved that control of land does not equal control of people. And sometimes the most dangerous threat to an empire is not a rival army at its borders, but farmers who decide they have nothing left to lose. If there is a lesson here, it is not about victory or defeat, it is about pressure. Systems can endure hardship for centuries, but when they change too quickly, they can fracture from within. Jerusalem in 1834 was not destroyed by invaders. It was shaken by the very people who sustained it. If you found this story compelling, consider what other overlooked moments quietly shaped the world we live in today. Let me know which event you would like explored next. And subscribe for more histories where the decisive moments are not always the loudest, but they are always the most consequential.